Welcome to Wild West Love Chronicles. In today's story, we follow an old, lonely rancher who gives away his only horse to a dying Apache youth. A selfless act done without promise, yet what returns is something greater than he ever imagined. A thundering herd of wild Mustangs and a second chance at life, born from compassion in the heart of the unforgiving West. The wind had a voice out in Arizona. It didn't howl or whisper like some poetic notion. It spoke, dry and blunt as old leather. It kicked up dust along the edges of cracked fences, rattled loose shingles on forgotten cabins, and made sure a man never forgot how small he was. Silas McGraw knew that voice better than any other. He'd heard it for years, long after conversation had left his life. No children's laughter, no woman's sigh. Just the groan of wood in the wind and the quiet company of his black stallion. Midnight. The old man moved slow but steady. His spine bowed from years under sun and saddle, and the sun had carved lines across his skin like tree bark. Each morning he rose with the light and stood on the porch, sipping from a dented tin cup. Not because the coffee was good, it wasn't, but because it was ritual. And ritual was survival when a man had nothing left to measure his days by. The ranch had once been lively. Chickens. 2 dogs, a boy who chased lizards under the porch, and a woman who sang while kneading bread. Now it was bone-dry earth in a sagging barn, with weeds where crops used to grow. The corral held only midnight now, his coat still as dark and glossy as the day Silas first broke him. A loyal beast, spirited, but never wild. The kind of horse a man could talk to when the silence got too heavy. That morning, like all others, Silas shoveled what was left of the oats into midnight's trough and ran a calloused hand down the horse's neck. "Still handsome, ain't you?" he muttered. Midnight snorted, nudging him like an old friend. Silas smiled, thin and tired. By midday, the heat had risen in waves off the land, turning the horizon into a shimmer. Silas sat in the shade of a rock outcrop with a book he'd read 6 times already, eyes drifting closed. Nothing new ever happened out here. Not anymore. Just sweat, sand, and memory. Until the birds came. Not the little songbirds that hid in the cactus blooms. No, these were buzzards, circling in lazy arcs above the ridge east of the property. Silas squinted up, letting the brim of his hat shield his eyes. "Too low for a carcass that size," he muttered, more to himself than anything else. He stood, stiff joints protesting, and fetched his rifle from inside the cabin. Midnight followed, unasked, as he often did, and they made their way toward the ridge. The path was rough, littered with dry scrub and sharp stone. Silas's boots stirred up dust as he climbed. The sun burned his neck, and sweat pooled in the hollow of his back. When he reached the crest, he saw it, down in the arroyo. At first, it looked like a pile of rags, or maybe a dead coyote. But something about the shape was wrong. He raised the rifle, more out of habit than threat, and descended slowly. As he neared, the shape shifted. It groaned. Human. Silas cursed under his breath. Closer now, he saw the boy, barely more than 17, if that. Apache by the look of him. His skin was dark but pale with blood loss, his chest rising in short, shallow gasps. His right leg was soaked red from thigh to knee, and the bullet hole near his hip had crusted over black. The boy's hands were cracked and burned, his mouth dry and blistered. He had nothing with him. No horse, no canteen, just a torn piece of deer hide wrapped around one wrist. Silas looked up. The buzzards had backed off for now, watching from their perches in silence. "Well, hell," he muttered. He stared at the boy for a long minute, unmoving. Years of hard living had carved prejudice into his bones. His family was gone because of this land, this conflict. Indians, outlaws, the government. They were all part of the same ruin. And yet, as he stood there with his finger on the rifle and the sun beating down, Silas didn't see a threat. He saw a dying child. The boy moaned again, reaching weakly toward nothing. His lips moved. A word, maybe, or a name. Silas sighed. Damn it! He slung the rifle back over his shoulder, knelt beside the boy, and touched his forehead, hot as a branding iron. This'll kill me, he said to himself. But he bent down, slid his arms under the boy's back and knees, and heaved him up with a grunt. Midnight waited nearby, calm as ever. Silas laid the boy across the saddle and walked alongside, one hand on the reins, the other steadying the weight. Back at the cabin, Silas laid him on the cot near the window and stripped away the boy's torn shirt. The wound was nasty, jagged and angry around the bullet's exit. Infection was already licking at the edges. Silas boiled water, tore up a clean shirt for bandages, and began working like he had back in the war, when there was no doctor, and only time and pain made men well. The boy drifted in and out, flinching at the heat, groaning when Silas pressed down with a cloth soaked in whiskey. He spoke now and then, but the words were soft and strange. Patchy, for sure. Maybe fragments of prayer. Once he opened his eyes, deep brown, almost black, and locked eyes with Silas. No fear there, just fire, and a plea unspoken. You got guts, kid, Silas muttered. Hope that's enough. That night, Silas sat at the edge of the cot, spooning drops of water into the boy's mouth. He'd stripped the wound, cleaned it again, and wrapped it as best he could. The fever worried him, though. It rose fast and clung stubborn. He glanced toward the window. Midnight paced outside, uneasy. You don't like it either, huh? He said. The boy stirred. His hand twitched, reaching toward Silas's arm. Horse. H-H-H, horse. Silas leaned in. What's that? The boy's lips cracked open, dry and barely moving. Horse. Ride. Home. East. Then he passed out again. Silas sat back, staring. A part of him, an old, bitter part, thought about saddling Midnight, putting the boy on, and sending him back into the wild. Let the desert decide. It wasn't his war. It wasn't his child. But another part remembered the way his own son had coughed blood one night during winter, just 9 years old. How he'd looked up, skin pale, and whispered for help Silas couldn't give. He poured more water into a cup, brought it to the boy's lips. You're not dying today, he said flatly. The fire cracked in the hearth. Outside, coyotes called to one another in the dark. Silas sat back in his chair, rifle leaning by the door, and stared into the flame. The boy breathed in uneven rhythm, damp with sweat, murmuring words Silas didn't know. In the silence, a tension took shape, unspoken and heavy. It wasn't just between the boy and Silas, or settler and Apache. It was something older, something that lived in the dust and the blood and the land itself. Silas didn't sleep that night. Not really. He just waited for the fever to break, or for death, whichever came first. And so the old man in the wound sat in the cradle of the desert, watched over by a black stallion and the slow, dry voice of the wind. The fire had burned low, leaving only a dull red pulse in the hearth like the last breath of a dying star. Outside, the desert held its breath under the cover of darkness. The coyotes were silent now, as if even they sensed the uneasy balance that hung inside the old cabin. Silas sat in the rocker beside the cot, still awake, though he hadn't meant to be. His bones ached from stillness, but he didn't move. The boy, Dakota, though Silas didn't yet know his name, lay curled in sweat-soaked sheets, his brow slick and glistening, his lips cracked and murmuring things Silas couldn't understand. The fever was rising. He didn't like how fast it had taken hold. He'd seen infection claim grown men in days, and this boy was no older than 19, if that, too young to die, and too far from anyone who might know how to stop it. Silas dipped the rag in the basin again, wrung it out, and pressed it to the boy's neck. The boy twitched, muttered something sharp and unfamiliar. Apache, Silas figured. He'd heard some of it during the war. Coarse, rhythmic syllables spoken like a fight. This wasn't that. It was softer, sadder, a prayer maybe. "Hold on," Silas muttered. "Ain't nobody here but me, kid. You got no choice but to live." The rag came back warm with sweat. He dipped it again. Midnight paced outside the cabin, hooves shuffling against the dry dirt. The horse hadn't settled all night. He was usually calm, a steady soul even during thunderstorms, but something had him agitated. Silas had noticed animals could feel death. They always did, before a man could. He didn't want to think about that. Instead, he focused on the boy's face. Even in sickness, there was a kind of strength there. Sharp cheekbones, dark hair clinging to his brow, a jaw clenched against the ache. He wasn't crying, not whimpering like some of the wounded Silas had seen during his soldiering days. No, this boy was fighting, just too weak to win. "Damn it," Silas muttered, rising stiffly. He crossed the room, yanked open the cupboard, and pulled out the last half bottle of whiskey. The good kind. Not because the boy would drink it, but because it might kill whatever was festering inside that wound. He uncorked it, poured some into a pan, and lit the stove. He didn't know if it would help. He wasn't a doctor, just a man who'd seen too many people die alone. When the liquid steamed, he poured it over a clean cloth and turned back to the cot. "I'm sorry for this," he said under his breath. He peeled back the makeshift bandage and pressed the hot cloth to the wound. The boy screamed. It was sudden, guttural, and loud enough to make Midnight bolt away from the window with a snort. Silas held the cloth down, grimacing, keeping pressure steady. The boy thrashed, fists weakly striking the air, legs kicking uselessly at the cot. "Hold still," Silas barked, his voice cracking like a whip. "You want to live or not?" It went on for nearly a minute, the boy half-conscious, writhing, the stink of infection rising off his body like smoke. When it was over, Dakota slumped back into the mattress, breathing fast, drenched in sweat. Silas wiped his forehead and sat down hard in the rocker. His own hands trembled. They stayed that way until the sky lightened through the window, faint gray at first, then pink at the edges. At some point, Silas must have dozed, because he woke to find the boy sitting upright in the cot, silent. It was jarring. He rubbed his eyes and leaned forward, unsure if he was dreaming. "You're awake," he said cautiously. The boy turned his head, eyes glassy but focused now. He didn't speak. Silas gestured to the cup on the side table. "You thirsty?" After a moment, the boy nodded, slowly, like it hurt. Silas handed him the tin cup. He drank, his lips shaking. "What's your name?" Silas asked. The boy looked at him for a long time before answering. "Dakota." Silas nodded. "I'm Silas." Dakota didn't repeat it. Just drank again and set the cup down. They sat in silence. It wasn't uncomfortable, not really. It was the kind of silence that filled most of Silas's life anyway. "You remember what happened?" Silas asked. Dakota's eyes drifted to the window. He said nothing. Silas didn't push. He didn't need to know. It didn't matter who shot the boy or why. The desert didn't care about reasons. It only cared about survival. "You were half dead when I found you. Wound looked bad. Still does." Dakota nodded. Barely. Silas stood, poured another cup of water, and held it out. The boy reached for it, then paused, his hand hovering. Silas followed his gaze. Dakota was staring at the rifle leaning against the wall. Silas didn't move. "I didn't bring you here to kill you," he said, calm. "That would have been easier out there." Dakota looked back at him and took the cup. It was a fragile moment, but a necessary one. Trust was a rare currency, and even more so between a white rancher and a wounded Apache. They spent most of the day in silence. Silas boiled water, changed the bandage, fed Dakota broth made from salted beef and boiled root. The boy ate little, but didn't resist. At one point, Dakota motioned toward the door and said, "Horse." Silas followed his finger to Midnight, who was grazing near the corral. "That's Midnight. Best damn horse west of the Colorado. Ain't for sale." Dakota nodded slowly, then closed his eyes again. By the third day, the fever had stabilized. Silas kept close watch, changing cloths, counting breaths. He spoke more than he meant to, rambling stories about the ranch, the war, the son he'd lost. Dakota didn't respond much, but his eyes stayed open, watching, listening. One afternoon, as Silas changed the bandage, Dakota winced and said something low in Apache. It sounded like a name, maybe a place. Silas didn't know. "You got kin somewhere?" Silas asked. Dakota nodded. "East, mountains, elders." He tapped his chest, then pointed toward the sunrise. "Can they help you?" Dakota nodded again, slower this time. "Too far to walk," Silas said. Dakota looked at midnight. Silas followed his gaze and exhaled hard. "No," he said. "Don't even think it." But Dakota kept looking, not with pleading, just a quiet certainty. That night, Silas sat on the porch with a pipe between his teeth, staring at the moon as it rose above the hills. Midnight stood nearby, tail swishing gently. The desert was quiet again, save for the low whistle of wind through the sage. Inside, Dakota slept, but not well. He tossed and muttered in his sleep. Names, places. Silas caught fragments. Sky Mother, Red Ridge, Eagle. He closed his eyes and leaned back. What the hell was he doing? A week ago, he wouldn't have opened his door to a stranger, let alone an Apache bleeding out in the dirt. But now the boy was here, alive because of him, asking, without asking, for a horse. His horse. The last piece of a life Silas had held on to. He couldn't do it. Midnight was all he had left. Giving him up would be like cutting off his own arm. But if he didn't, the boy would die. The next morning, Silas sat beside the cot as Dakota opened his eyes. "I got a question for you," he said. "You make it to those mountains. What then?" Dakota looked at him, chest rising and falling. "Healer, spirits, life." Silas rubbed his jaw. "And if you don't?" Dakota's eyes didn't flinch. "Then I die." The words were simple, heavy. Silas stood, crossed to the window, and looked out at midnight grazing under the rising sun. "You're lucky he likes you," he muttered. He didn't turn around, didn't say another word, just walked outside, began packing a saddlebag with water, jerky, and a flask. He brought Midnight to the front porch and tied the reins loosely. Inside, Dakota was already trying to sit up, gritting his teeth against the pain. Silas entered, hands on his hips. "You ride slow. You stop if the wound opens. You keep Midnight fed and watered." Dakota looked at him, eyes wide. Then, slowly, he nodded. Silas helped him outside, lifting him gently onto the saddle. Dakota winced, but held steady. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Then Dakota said, "Silas." The old man blinked. "Thank you." Silas nodded, not trusting his voice. Dakota touched his chest, then pointed to the sun. 7 days. Then, without another word, he clicked his tongue and turned Midnight toward the horizon. Silas watched him ride east, a lone figure shrinking against the rising heat. He stood there long after the boy disappeared, the wind tugging at his shirt, his face empty. He returned inside, sat on the edge of the cot where the boy had lain, and ran a hand through his hair. The room felt hollow now. So did he. Night came. No fire, no conversation, just silence again. But it felt heavier than before. And somewhere, in the dark, the coyotes cried again. The sun rose without ceremony. It spilled slowly over the land like melted copper, slipping across the dust and dry brush, painting long shadows across the porch boards. Silas stood outside, one hand resting on the porch beam, the other cradling a tin cup gone cold. He hadn't sipped it once. The taste of coffee didn't matter this morning. Nothing did. Midnight was gone. Dakota, too. Only the wind remained, constant, quiet, and empty. It moved through the grassless yard, over the broken fence rails, through the broken teeth of a shutter that never got fixed. The sound of it had once been comforting. Not anymore. Silas hadn't slept. After Dakota rode out, he'd sat at the edge of the porch until the sun dipped below the western ridge, and even then, he hadn't gone in. Just moved to the rocker and sat like a ghost with eyes open, trying to hear hoofbeats that never came back. The cabin felt hollow. Not just quiet. Vacant. There was a mark in the mattress where the boy had slept. A dent in the pillow where his dark hair had rested. A few drops of dried blood still lingered in the corner of the wash basin, no matter how many times Silas rinsed it out. He lit a fire that evening out of habit, but didn't cook. Sat in the chair and smoked, long pipe between his lips, watching the embers drift up the chimney into the dark like spirits he didn't believe in. The boy had said 7 days. It was easy to dismiss. Maybe he'd said it out of hope. Maybe the mountains were farther than he remembered. Maybe time meant something else to him. Or maybe, and this is what Silas feared most, maybe Dakota was already dead. He could imagine it too easily. The desert was a wide mouth full of sharp teeth. It had claimed better men than that boy. Even with midnight, it would be a brutal journey. No shelter. No water beyond the few trickles Silas had pointed out. Rattlesnakes, coyotes, soldiers, other men. The kind that shot first and never asked. On the second morning, Silas fed the chickens even though there were only 3 left. He drew water from the well and sat on the edge, watching the ripples settle. He thought about riding out, following the tracks, maybe just far enough to find out if the boy had made it through the pass. But even if he did, what then? Drag him back? Drag him where? He didn't belong with Silas any more than Silas belonged out in that wilderness now. That horse and boy had ridden off into something sacred. The old man's place was here, alone. The days blurred. He mended a split rail in the corral fence even though there were no horses left to hold. He patched the side of the barn that had leaned too long under storms. He sharpened his old skinning knife twice, then forgot where he'd set it. On the 3rd night he drank. It had been a long time since he let the bottle open without reason. He wasn't the kind to dull things with whiskey, but silence was harder than pain. And this kind of silence, the kind that settled into your bones like sickness, could rot a man if he didn't numb it. He drank by the fire, looking through the smoke at the place where the boy had once slept. He remembered another boy, younger, barefoot, running through the same doorway with a stick in his hand, pretending it was a rifle. Laughing. He'd been sick for 3 days, just a fever at first, then coughing, then blood, and then silence. Silas had carried his son out past the edge of the homestead and buried him beneath the cottonwood tree where they used to watch the sun fall. He never marked the grave. Didn't want to. The land would remember him. That was enough. On the 4th day, Silas walked the property edge. He found buzzard feathers near the ravine, 6 or 7 of them, scattered in the sand like the aftermath of a fight. There were prints in the dirt, too, horse prints and faint drag marks. He knelt, tracing the edge of one. Could have been Midnight's hooves, could have been someone else's. He didn't follow them. Instead, he returned to the house and lit a candle that night, even though the moon was full. The air felt heavy, and something in his chest sat like a rock, a weight that didn't shift when he breathed. That night, the dreams returned. He saw the boy again, Dakota, standing in a field of ash, barefoot, staring toward a canyon that shimmered like heat wave. Midnight stood beside him, ribs showing, mane tangled. Dakota looked back at Silas and raised a hand. Behind him, silhouettes danced. They didn't walk. They moved, like fire with legs. Spirits or devils, he didn't know. But they weren't human. Their faces were blank, just shadows shaped like men. In the dream, Silas called out. His voice cracked. Nothing came. Dakota turned and walked into the canyon. The horse followed, and the spirits followed them both. Silas woke up gasping, hands clenched around the bedsheet like reins. The 5th day was dry. No clouds, no wind, just sun and silence. He climbed the ridge that afternoon, the same one where he'd first seen the buzzards circling. From there, he could see all the way east, flat stretch of desert, red earth scattered with patches of stone, creosote, and brittle scrub. Nothing moved, no smoke, no riders. Just heat rising, like ghosts from the sand. He stood there for a long time, trying to convince himself the boy had made it. He hadn't believed in much for years. Not God, not signs, not spirits. but he whispered something into the wind that day, standing with his hat pressed to his chest, eyes squinting against the light. I gave him all I had. It wasn't a prayer, not really, more of a statement. He didn't expect an answer. The 6th day dragged. He woke early, before light, and waited on the porch, the kind of waiting that didn't even know what it wanted. He listened to every gust of wind, every creak of wood, every rustle in the grass. Mid-morning he thought he heard hoofbeats. He walked half a mile out with a rifle slung over his shoulder, heart beating harder than it should. It was nothing. Just the wind shifting rocks down a slope. By evening he stopped checking. The 7th day came with clouds, high and thin, but enough to cool the sun's bite. He didn't sleep that night either, just sat in the chair near the hearth with the fire unlit, watching the horizon through the open window. Some part of him had already grieved, not just for the boy, but for midnight, and for himself too, because letting go of that horse had felt like digging the last grave. The 8th day dawned red, not gold, not pink, red, like fire behind smoke. The sky cracked open over the ridge like someone had sliced it with a knife. Silas stepped onto the porch, drawn by the color. The ground was trembling. He didn't notice it at first, just the cup in his hand rattling against the railing. Then he felt it, in his boots, in his teeth. A deep, low pulse, like thunder underground. He frowned. There were no storms this time of year. Then came the sound. It wasn't wind. Or hooves. It was both, wind being carried by hooves. He turned his eyes east. At first, all he saw was dust, then shapes, dozens of them. Horses, a whole damn herd. And at the front, one rider. Midnight's black coat shone like oil in the firelight sky. His legs moved like silk over sand, strong and sure. And on his back, Dakota, alive, sitting tall in the saddle, his chest wrapped in fresh cloth, a necklace of feathers and beads around his neck, his dark hair tied back with red thread. His face was calm, determined. Behind him, the wild Mustangs thundered. Chestnuts, palominos, paints, grays. More horses than Silas had seen in a single place since he was a boy. They followed Dakota not as if he herded them, as if they chose to follow. Silas didn't move, didn't breathe. The herd slowed as it reached the edge of the property, splitting to flow around the barn, the corral, the house like water around a rock. Dakota reined Midnight in just short of the porch. He dismounted slowly, wincing as his feet hit the dirt. Silas couldn't find his voice. Dakota stepped forward, breathing hard, then reached out and placed a hand on Silas's shoulder. "I told them," he said, his voice steady, "about the man who gave his only horse." Silas swallowed, but his throat was too dry to speak. "They said a gift like that comes back. Not the same," Dakota said, motioning to the herd behind him. "But more." Silas's knees buckled. He sat down on the porch steps, eyes wide, hands trembling. Midnight walked up beside Dakota and nuzzled Silas's shoulder. The old man leaned into the horse without a word. Tears ran down his face. He didn't know if they were for the horse, or the boy, or the miracle that just walked out of the desert and reminded him he was still alive. He didn't care. He just let them fall. Silas couldn't remember when he'd last wept. Maybe when his wife passed. Maybe before that. Maybe not since he was a boy. But as Midnight pressed his head against his chest, and the warmth of the stallion's breath fogged his sleeve, something broke loose inside him that had been buried for too long. He didn't try to hide it. The tears came slow, then faster. Not dramatic, just steady. A release, like rain on cracked soil. His hand shook as he reached for Midnight's mane, clutching it like a lifeline, not caring that Dakota stood just a few feet away, watching in silence. Dakota said nothing. He let the old man lean against the animal and simply stood there, boots in the dirt, wrapped in the quiet strength of someone who had seen death and returned from it. The herd had stilled. Dozens of wild Mustangs, milling gently around the property, moving in slow circles like dancers at rest. They didn't bolt, didn't snort or stamp. They didn't act wild at all. They watched, calm, alert, as if they understood that this land had changed. Silas pulled himself together after a few minutes and wiped his face on his sleeve, sniffing once without apology. Then he looked up at Dakota and tried to speak. "What the hell did you?" His voice cracked and gave out. He cleared his throat. "Where did you come from? What is this?" Dakota looked out over the herd, his eyes calm. "I found them in the high mesas," he said. "They followed." Silas blinked. "Followed?" "Wild horses don't follow people." Dakota met his gaze. "They do when they remember your spirit." Silas stared at him, confused. "What are you talking about?" Dakota walked forward and sat beside Silas on the steps. He moved carefully, still favoring his side where the wound had been. But his movements were steady, controlled. The boy who had ridden out days earlier, half dead and broken, was gone. This was a different person, a man now. Or something beyond that. "I made it to the sacred grounds," he said quietly. "Barely. My people found me at the edge of the ravine. They carried me the rest of the way. The healer took the bullet sickness out. She burned sage, gave me roots, chanted for 3 nights. I don't remember all of it." Silas watched him, silent. "I told them about you. A white man who gave his last horse to an Apache. One he didn't know. One he had reason not to help. You were just a kid," Silas muttered. "Most wouldn't have seen that," Dakota replied. "They would have seen my skin, my braids, my blood. But you saw a boy." Silas didn't respond. He couldn't. Dakota looked out over the herd again. "They told me the herd had been spotted near the edge of the canyon, grazing on the rim. Our people used to know those horses. They say they were touched by the sky, untamed but not wild, sacred, born of earth and wind. They do not serve, but they understand." "Understand what?" Silas asked, his voice low. "Gifts," Dakota said. "Real ones. The kind that take something out of your chest and don't give it back. They felt it. They followed." Silas leaned back against the wall of the cabin, staring out at the open yard filled with the horses. "They followed you all the way back?" Dakota nodded. "They didn't run. They didn't scatter. Not once. When I turned to sleep, they waited. When I rode, they came behind. I didn't lead them. I just didn't say no." Silas rubbed the bridge of his nose, overwhelmed. "I don't know what to say to that." Dakota smiled slightly. "You don't have to." They sat in silence, the kind that didn't demand words. After a while, Silas stood up and walked down the steps into the open yard. The horses parted around him, not spooked. He reached out and touched the shoulder of a dappled mare. She flinched slightly, then leaned into his hand. He turned in a slow circle, eyes wide as he took in the whole herd. It wasn't just numbers. It was color, power, spirit. Each horse carried something ancient in its bones. Dakota joined him. "I can't keep all of these," Silas said. "No," Dakota replied. "They're not yours." Silas raised an eyebrow. Then, "What the hell are they doing here?" Dakota bent down and picked up a stone, turning it over in his hand. "They're here because they chose to be. Because your land is sacred now." Silas scoffed. "My land? It's damn near dead. I haven't grown crops in 3 years. Barns falling in, wind gets through the windows. What's sacred about that? You gave your last breath to save someone you didn't know. That's sacred." Silas didn't respond. Dakota tossed the stone aside and looked back at the horses. "They're not here to be broken or sold. They're here to rest and to remind." "Remind me of what?" "That there's still life in this place." Silas stared at him. The wind kicked up again, not harsh, just steady. The tails of the horses flicked. Some turned their heads, others grazed. One stallion, gray and massive, walked slowly across the yard, and stopped in front of Silas. He was scarred along the flank. One eye was clouded over white. But his stance was proud, unshaken. Silas stood still. The stallion leaned forward and bumped his shoulder gently against the man's chest, then moved past him, circling wide toward the open barn. "I guess I'm gonna need more feed," Silas muttered. Dakota laughed for the first time, a real laugh, soft and quiet and full of something that hadn't been there the week before. "You'll need more than that," he said. "You'll need a fence that doesn't fall over." "You volunteering to build it?" Dakota tilted his head. "If I stay." Silas looked at him. "Do you want to?" Dakota glanced toward the sunrise. "My elders say the land remembers kindness. If I stay here, maybe I can help it remember." Silas didn't say yes. He didn't say no. But when they walked back to the house, side by side, the answer was clear. The next few days passed like something from another life. Silas rose at dawn and found Dakota already awake, feeding the horses near the stream that ran from the northern slope. It had gone dry some seasons, but this week it ran full, almost stubbornly. Silas filled his bucket and splashed his face. They worked together. Dakota repaired the barn wall using planks from the old woodshed. Silas showed him how to reinforce the joists and brace the door hinges with scrap iron. They fixed the corral, dug new fence posts, and even cleared the wellhead to get cleaner water flow. The Mustangs stayed nearby, not penned, not claimed, just present. At night they sat on the porch, sometimes talking, sometimes not. The fire pit crackled. The stars above looked closer than they had in years. Dakota told him about his people. His grandfather, who taught him to ride bareback at 5 years old. His mother, who braided his hair before each ceremony. His sister, who sang with a voice like river water. Silas told him about his son, how he used to climb on to midnight before he was tall enough to mount, how he once tried to build a kite out of flour sacks and sticks, how he died so fast that Silas didn't have time to say goodbye. They shared food, words, and silence, and the land responded. Flowers began blooming in places they hadn't before. The soil turned soft near the waterbed. Even the birds returned, sparrows, finches, red-tailed hawks overhead. The ranch lived again. News traveled. By the end of the second week, a man rode in from the trading post down south, said he'd heard of a miracle herd, living wild near the McGraw land. Said someone claimed the old rancher had brought him in himself. Silas shrugged. "Let 'em say what they want." The man offered coin. "A lot of it." Silas shook his head. "They're not mine to sell." The man left angry, but more would come. Silas knew that. The world always wanted what it couldn't understand. Dakota wasn't worried. "They won't stay if they're not welcome," he said. "But they know you are." That evening, a group of children arrived. Apache, mostly. A few from neighboring tribes. Dakota sat with them under the cottonwood and told stories in both English and their native tongue. He drew symbols in the dirt and let them touch the horses under his watchful eye. Silas stood back, watching. He felt no bitterness, only peace. Later that night, Dakota handed him a necklace, beads of turquoise and a carved piece of dark wood. "For you," he said. Silas turned it over in his hand. "What's it mean?" "It means you're not alone anymore." He didn't have words for that. He didn't need them. He wore it every day after. By the third week, the barn held hay again. The cabin had a new door latch. The windows were patched. A second stall had been added to the side shelter for visiting horses. Silas walked every morning, not out of loneliness, out of habit. He checked the stream, walked the ridge, looked out toward the east. He still remembered the silence. He just didn't live in it anymore. One morning, he watched Dakota braid a rope from horsehair while teaching a girl to knot it properly. He smiled. This land had changed. So had he. And somewhere in the hills, a herd of sacred horses still ran free, not owned, not broken, just present, just watching. And they remembered the man who gave his only horse to a dying boy. The morning came soft, the way it did when the desert was at peace. Clouds stretched thin and glowing over the wide plain, painted in the kind of gold you only saw when the heat had stepped aside for cooler air. The breeze carried the scent of creosote and dry sage, mingled with the faint dust that rose as hooves disturbed the land. A quiet rhythm drifted from the open field, low, steady, and rich with motion. Horses, grazing and wandering, snorted and shook their manes in the soft light. Silas sat on the porch, cup in hand, worn boots crossed at the ankle. He wasn't leaning forward like he used to. He wasn't scanning the horizon. His body didn't hold tension anymore. There was stillness in him now, the kind that only came when a man had run out of things to fear or finally stopped fighting shadows. Midnight stood at the edge of the corral, close enough to see but far enough to remain untouched unless called. His coat was still black as smoke, though the gray around his muzzle had crept in slowly over the months. He moved with the same grace he always had, but his pace had slowed, not from pain but from wisdom. Dakota stepped out from behind the barn, shirt half-buttoned, sleeves rolled, carrying a leather satchel across his back. He walked barefoot now, always had since spring came. Set let him feel the heartbeat of the earth. "You're up early," Silas called out. Dakota smiled without breaking his stride. "The sky woke me." He crossed the yard and dropped the satchel beside the porch steps, settling onto the top rail with the ease of a man born for balance. "There's a new foal near the western slope," he said. "Painted legs, still shaky." Silas took a sip of his coffee. "Another one? They like this place. Course they do." He smirked. "It's the company!" Dakota chuckled and looked out at the herd. "It's the memory." Silas leaned back, letting the breeze run past his face. "How long's it been now?" he asked. Dakota shrugged. "More than a season. Feels longer. Feels right." They sat in silence for a few minutes. The birds were back, finches nesting in the rafters above the porch, calling to one another in high, quick notes. A pair of rabbits darted past the open gate and disappeared behind the water trough. Things had changed. There was color now where once there was only dirt. Wildflowers grew near the cottonwood. Grass stretched green and unruly along the fence line. The stream ran strong even through the dry spells. Visitors came more often now. Families. Ranchers. Young ones. Old ones. Not in droves, but in trickles. Like respectful rain. Some came to see the horses. Some came to ask about the story. Some just came to sit. The place held something in it, quiet, deep, and rooted. They felt it even if they didn't understand it. Silas never turned anyone away. He didn't say much either. The legend had begun to grow. Folks said the herd came from the sky, that the horses were sent by spirits to watch over the land, that an old man had died and come back in the body of a Mustang, that an Apache boy had whispered a prayer so strong the land itself had answered. Most of it wasn't true, but Silas let them talk. Because the truth didn't live in the telling. It lived in the dust and the hoofprints and the way the land breathed easy again. Dakota stood and stretched. "I'm taking the kids to the ridge later," he said. "Teach them how to read the clouds." Silas raised an eyebrow. "Cloud reading? That's some kind of magic?" Dakota grinned. "Only if you don't understand it." Silas shook his head, smiling. "I'll ride with you to the fence line," he said. "Need to check the north posts. Coyote's been nosing around again." "Good, bring the hammer." "Always." They spent the morning side by side, walking the edges of the land they'd reclaimed. Where the posts leaned, Silas drove them deeper. Where the brush had overgrown, Dakota cleared it with a hooked blade made from river stone and oak. They didn't rush. There was no reason to. The land moved slow. So did they. By mid-afternoon the children arrived, 5 in total, 2 Apache, 1 Navajo, and 2 ranch-born kids from town. They rode in on small, steady ponies, laughing and shouting across the open field. Dakota met them with open arms, giving each a feather to tie in their hair. Silas watched from a distance. It felt strange to witness joy again without suspicion. The sound of children's laughter had once been something he couldn't bear. Now it rolled over him like water over stone, smoothing out the edges without erasing them. Dakota led the group west, into the canyon paths where the shadows grew tall and the wind whispered around the stone. Silas returned to the porch, sat, and waited. As the sun dipped low, painting the land in amber light, he stood slowly and walked out past the barn. Midnight followed, uncalled. They reached the tree, the cottonwood. It was taller now than it had been. Greener. It wasn't just a tree anymore, it was a marker. Not of death, but of memory. He knelt there sometimes, spoke sometimes. But today, he just stood, hand resting on the trunk, eyes closed. He thought of his wife, his son, the boy he buried, the boy he saved. And for the first time in his long life, he didn't feel like a man at the end of something. He felt like a man inside it. The herd returned near twilight. The sound of their hooves was music now, not thunder. They moved like one being, fluid and strong, dust trailing like mist. Dakota brought the children in behind them, each wide-eyed and grinning. Silas waited by the gate. The lead stallion, a massive bay with fire in his step, paused beside him and blew air into his hand. Silas reached up and scratched behind his ear. "You keeping the others in line?" he muttered. The horse blinked slow, calm. Good. That night, after the fire had burned low and the children had fallen asleep in the barn loft, Silas and Dakota sat under the stars. The sky was wide open, littered with light. No clouds, no sound but crickets and the soft breathing of horses nearby. Dakota leaned back, arms folded behind his head. "There's a story my grandfather told," he said. "Let's hear it." He said, the first horse was born from lightning, that when the sky grew angry and struck the earth, the ground cracked and gave birth to something wild. It ran from the fire and never stopped. That's why horses still carry the storm in their legs. Silas listened quietly. "My people believe the land remembers," Dakota continued. "Every kindness, every wound, every gift. The earth keeps it all." Silas looked over at him. "You think she'll remember me?" Dakota didn't smile. He just nodded. "She already has." The next morning, Silas didn't wake up. He lay still in bed, hands folded on his chest, mouth slightly open like he was caught mid-breath. The window was open, and the breeze drifted in, carrying the scent of horses and morning dew. Dakota found him just past dawn. He didn't cry. He just sat beside the bed and placed one hand over Silas's, whispering a word in Apache that meant journey. The burial was quiet. Just Dakota, the children, and the herd nearby. They placed him beneath the cottonwood. No stone, no cross, just earth, and a small feather tied to a branch above. Midnight stood nearby the whole time, unmoving. The day passed slow, the sun didn't rush, and the wind stayed gentle. That evening, Dakota stood at the porch and looked out at the land. He was older now, even if not in years. He walked with the steadiness of someone who'd carried loss and still chosen to return. He taught the children to ride with respect, not power. He told stories of Silas McGraw, the rancher who gave his only horse to a dying Apache and got a living legend in return. The herd stayed, not always in sight but never far. And in the quietest hours, when the stars watched without blinking and the wind spoke in its slow, deep voice, Dakota sometimes swore he saw a black horse galloping across the ridge, mane wild, hooves silent, eyes shining. And beside him, a rider, not young, not old, just free. In the silence of the desert, where time forgets and legends are born, one man's selfless gift became the spark that brought life back to the land and to himself. Silas McGraw didn't just give up his last horse, he gave hope, and hope came back, not as one, but as a thundering herd that changed everything. Some stories carve themselves into stone, others ride on the wind. This one rides forever. If stories like this stir your heart and take you back to a time when grit, honor, and love shaped the West, then saddle up and hit that subscribe button. Join us here at Wild West Love Chronicles for more untold legends, unforgettable characters, and the kind of storytelling that leaves dust on your boots and fire in your soul. Don't miss the next ride. Subscribe now. The West remembers those who listen.